The first sign that something was off came from the sound of an engine idling where it never used to linger. Most mornings, I crossed the bridge just after sunrise. It was a narrow thing, wood planks darkened by years of rain, steel rails rubbed dull by passing tires. It sat low over a shallow cut of water and rock, nothing dramatic, but it held. Always had. My truck knew the rhythm of it. Tires on gravel, a brief hollow thump as the bridge took my weight, then the steady climb toward the main road. 5 seconds, maybe less. Long enough to notice the mist when the air was cold. Short enough to forget it entirely once I reached pavement. That morning, the bridge wasn't empty. A white pickup was parked just before it, hazard lights blinking lazily. 2 orange cones stood where the entrance usually opened. No barricade, no warning sign beyond a laminated sheet clipped to a metal stand, fluttering in the breeze. I slowed, rolled down my window, and read it twice. Temporary closure for safety assessment. No name, no contact number. Just the HOA's logo in the corner, printed crisp and confident. I shut off my engine and listened. The creek below made the same soft noise it always did. Birds moved through the trees. Somewhere down the road, a garage door opened, then closed again. Normal sounds arranged around something that suddenly wasn't. The man in the white pickup leaned against his door, coffee in hand. He gave me a polite nod, the kind you offer when you assume everyone's on the same page. "Won't take long," he said. "They're finally doing something about this old thing." I asked who they were. He gestured vaguely toward the neighborhood behind me, the cluster of houses that used the bridge every day without thinking about it. The gesture carried the weight of habit more than certainty. I turned the truck around and took the long way out, 6 extra miles of rutted road that curved through fields and fence lines. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was higher and my coffee was cold. Later that afternoon, I walked back down to the bridge. The cones were gone, replaced by a strip of yellow tape and a temporary fence panel. Someone had nailed a notice directly into the timber railing. I didn't pull it down, I took a picture instead. Then another, close-ups, wide shots. The date and time captured cleanly in the corner of my phone. I stood there longer than I needed to. Not angry, not yet. Mostly curious. For years, the bridge had been invisible because it worked, because it belonged to the land, not to anyone's attention. Watching it cordoned off like shared property felt less like an insult and more like a misunderstanding that had been allowed to grow comfortable. As I walked back toward the house, I wondered how long that comfort would last once the bridge was no longer something people could simply assume. By the second morning, the absence had shape. I felt it before I saw it, an extra quiet on the gravel road, the kind that comes when a routine breaks and hasn't yet been replaced. No early engines, no tires rolling over wood, just the wind moving dust in small, undecided circles. When I reached the bend where the bridge should have been visible, a new sign stood there, planted firmly in the dirt like it had always belonged. Access closed, improvements in progress. This one had a phone number. I called it from the driver's seat, window down, notebook open on the passenger side. The woman who answered spoke the way people do when they're used to being the final step in a process. "This is the Homeowners Association," she said. "How can I help you?" I told her my name. I told her where I lived. I told her I owned the land beneath the bridge and the bridge itself. There was a pause, not long but deliberate, followed by the sound of typing. "Yes," she said calmly. "We're aware of the bridge's location. The board authorized a temporary removal for safety compliance. It's a shared access point." I didn't argue with the phrasing. I asked for the work order, the permitting documents, the written agreement that allowed alteration of private infrastructure. Another pause, this one longer. Well, she said, choosing her words with care, the bridge has been used by the neighborhood for decades. That establishes precedent. I wrote that word down, precedent. I asked who had notified me. She apologized, not personally, but procedurally. The assumption, she explained, was that the bridge fell under common use. This is a routine improvement. Routine, another word worth keeping. I drove down later that day to see what temporary removal meant. The planks were already stacked to one side. The steel rails lay in the grass, tagged with bright paint. The creek ran open now, uninterrupted. A gap where weight used to pass. A man with a clipboard took measurements without looking up when I approached. I didn't stop him. I didn't tell him to leave. I stood back and let the work continue, documenting quietly. Photos, notes. Times, I made sure the property markers were visible in the frame. By evening, cars were backing up along the gravel road. One driver leaned out his window and asked how long this was supposed to last. I told him I didn't know. That was true. The next morning, the woman from the HOA called me. She spoke with confidence, not hostility. She explained timelines, inspections, liability concerns. She said the bridge would be better than before when it returned. I listened. I thanked her for the update. I asked for everything in writing. After the call, I walked down to the creek again. Without the bridge, the space felt wider than it ever had. Not louder, not dramatic, just exposed. I had the sense that everyone involved believed this was nearly resolved. I wasn't so sure. By the third day, people started adjusting their clocks. I noticed it from my porch just after 6 in the morning. Headlights crept along the gravel earlier than usual, slower, uncertain. A few drivers stopped where the bridge used to be, sat there for a moment as if expecting it to reappear, then reversed carefully, dust rising behind them. The detour added time, and time has a way of announcing itself when it's taken without warning. I took my coffee down the path toward the creek. The work crew hadn't returned yet. The bridge site was quiet, marked by orange mesh and a neat stack of lumber that already looked out of place, like something borrowed and forgotten. Without the structure, the creek seemed less contained. Water moved where it wanted. The banks showed old tire marks I'd never noticed before, impressions layered year over year. Around mid-morning, the HOA representative arrived in a dark sedan that didn't like gravel roads. She stepped out carefully, shoes already dusted, a folder tucked under her arm. She smiled in a professional way, the kind that assumes cooperation as a given. "I wanted to introduce myself properly," she said. "I'm managing the bridge project." We walked together toward the creek. She spoke about inspections and updated materials about reducing long-term risk. Her tone never shifted. Calm, administrative. Certain that the framework she worked within was solid, I asked when the bridge would be put back. "Once the new structure is approved," she said, "there's a process." I asked how the neighborhood was supposed to function in the meantime. She gestured toward the trees, the long road curling away from us. "The alternate route is available. It's inconvenient but temporary." Temporary. Another word that sounded different depending on which side of the inconvenience you stood on. I didn't mention the property lines. I didn't correct her when she referred to the bridge as community infrastructure. I asked for the timeline again, slower this time, letting the silence stretch between her sentences. Before she left, she handed me a printed notice. It outlined the scope of work and included a general completion window. Weeks, not days. I thanked her and watched her car struggle slightly as it turned around. That afternoon, a delivery truck stopped at my gate. The driver asked if this was the way through to the neighborhood. I told him it used to be. He sighed, rerouted, and left. I began receiving emails that evening, not complaints exactly. Questions, clarifications. Could residents walk across the creek? Could emergency vehicles use temporary access? Was there a schedule posted somewhere? I replied to none of them. Instead, I organized my documentation. Deeds, surveys, photos, correspondence. I laid them out on the table, not with urgency, but with care. Outside, the road remained quiet longer than it used to. The bridge's absence had slowed everything without stopping it completely. That, I realized, was the most revealing part. When access becomes effort instead of assumption, people start looking more closely at what they've been relying on. The fourth morning brought a change in tone. It started with a knock, not sharp, not insistent, but early enough to feel deliberate. When I opened the door, the HOA representative stood on the step again, this time without the folder. She looked rested, composed, as if she'd already decided how the conversation would go. "We've had some concerns raised," she said. "Nothing formal, just questions." I invited her to sit at the table. Through the window, we could see the gravel road stretching toward the empty creek crossing. A school bus passed the far end, then disappeared around the bend, taking the longer route. She spoke carefully, choosing language that framed inconvenience as an adjustment period. Residents were late to work. Deliveries were being rescheduled. One homeowner had asked about medical access just in case. She emphasized that these were temporary disruptions expected in any infrastructure project. I asked whether the board had considered alternatives before removing the bridge. She paused. The bridge failed inspection criteria. Replacement was the most responsible option. Did it fail? I asked. Or did it simply not meet updated standards? She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she explained the association's obligation to manage shared access safely. The word shared surfaced again lightly, as if repetition could make it factual. I slid the survey map across the table. I didn't point. I let it sit there, lines and markers speaking quietly. She glanced at it, then back at me. "Our understanding," she said, "is that use over time establishes a form of collective responsibility." I nodded. "Use doesn't change ownership," I replied, not sharply, just clearly. The conversation didn't escalate. It didn't need to. She acknowledged the documents without conceding authority. I acknowledged the inconvenience without accepting liability. When she left, the situation remained unresolved, balanced on procedure rather than agreement. By afternoon, the work crew returned. Instead of rebuilding, they began clearing, more than necessary, brush cut back, ground leveled. The absence widened. I took photos from the same angles as before, the contrast easy to track. That evening, a temporary sign appeared at the far end of the road, directing traffic to the detour. Someone had written the expected delay in marker, plus 15 min. I watched a line of cars approach, slow, turn away. No one crossed the creek anymore. The bridge had gone from invisible to defining in a matter of days. I received a final email before sunset. The HOA representative thanked me for my patience and assured me that progress was being made. She asked if I would be willing to discuss shared solutions once the replacement design was finalized. I didn't respond right away. I walked down to the creek instead, stood where the bridge used to meet the bank. Without it, the land felt unmistakably mine again, not in a territorial sense, but in clarity. Ownership, I thought, isn't loud. It just waits for the moment it's needed. The fifth day brought the first hint of coordination. It showed up as chalk lines on the dirt and small flags pressed into the soil along the creek bank. Someone had measured, recalculated, and decided where the next structure should sit. The placement was familiar but subtly shifted, angled to favor efficiency over alignment. It wasn't careless. It was practical in the way decisions become when land is treated as available rather than owned. I watched from a distance as the crew worked through their plan. No one asked permission. No one checked boundaries. They followed diagrams and schedules, trusting that precedent would carry them the rest of the way. Mid-morning, the HOA representative called again. Her voice was steady, almost conciliatory. "We're making progress," she said. "The updated design should improve access and meet compliance." I asked where the new bridge would sit. She described it. I compared her description to the survey lines in my head. There was overlap, not much. Enough. "I'll need to review that," I said. She agreed readily. "Of course. We'll send the plans." When they arrived an hour later, I printed them and laid them beside my own documents. The difference was subtle but telling. The new structure assumed an easement that had never been granted. The access road widened slightly, the footprint extending into land I had kept deliberately untouched. I marked the discrepancies in pencil, not corrections, observations. That afternoon, a resident stopped by the gate. He spoke politely, apologetically, as if inconveniencing me simply by standing there. "We're just trying to figure out timing," he said. "People are worried." I told him I understood. I told him I was reviewing the situation. He nodded, relieved by the idea that someone was in control, even if he didn't know who that was anymore. By evening, the creek bank showed signs of preparation, stakes driven deeper, equipment staged. The bridge was no longer just absent. It was being replaced by an assumption made physical. I sent one email before sunset, short, factual. I acknowledged receipt of the plans. I noted that the proposed structure encroached on private land and that no easement existed to authorize construction. I didn't threaten. I didn't demand. I asked how the board intended to proceed given that constraint. The reply came an hour later. The HOA representative thanked me for raising the concern and said they would review internally. That night, the road stayed quiet longer than usual. No late arrivals, no last-minute crossings. The detour had settled into people's routines, but uneasily, like a borrowed coat that didn't quite fit. Lying in bed, I thought about how easily systems form around convenience, and how fragile they become when the convenience is questioned. The bridge hadn't been a favor, it had been a fact, and facts, once reintroduced, have a way of slowing everything down. By the sixth morning, the detour had acquired personality. You could hear it in the way engines accelerated harder at the far bend, in the uneven timing of departures that used to align without effort. The road absorbed the change quietly, but people didn't. They adjusted in small, visible ways, leaving earlier, returning later, planning errands with a new caution that hadn't existed before. The bridge site, meanwhile, went still. No crew, no equipment running. Just the flags and stakes from the day before, standing where they'd been left, as if someone had paused mid-thought. I walked down after breakfast and noticed fresh footprints that stopped short of the creek, turned around and doubled back. Decision deferred. Late morning, the HOA representative called again. Her tone had shifted, not in volume or politeness, but in pacing. She spoke more slowly now, as if each sentence had been weighed before delivery. "The board has reviewed the survey information," she said. "There appears to be some ambiguity regarding the access footprint." Ambiguity was a generous word. I let it pass. She explained that the association was exploring options, temporary access, revised placement, alternate materials. She asked if I would consider granting a short-term easement to keep things moving. I asked what terms she had in mind. There was a pause, papers shuffled. "We haven't finalized that yet," she said. "We wanted to understand your position first." "My position hasn't changed," I replied. "The bridge and the land are mine. Any access across it requires permission." She acknowledged that formally. No argument, no pushback. Just a note added to the file, audible in the click of her keyboard. That afternoon, a notice went up at the neighborhood entrance. It listed revised commute expectations and advised residents to allow extra time until further notice. The phrase carried weight now. It wasn't a timeline. It was an admission. I began receiving fewer emails and more indirect messages, neighbors asking neighbors what they'd heard, speculation passing through the gaps left by official silence. I stayed out of it. The situation didn't need commentary. It needed space. Near dusk, I drove the detour myself, slowly counting the minutes. 15 if you hit every stop clean, 20 if you didn't. Longer if a truck met you on the narrow stretch and someone had to back up. On the return, I parked where the bridge used to begin and sat there with the engine off. The creek reflected the last light of the day uninterrupted. No boards, no rails, just water and open air. Access hadn't been denied. It had been displaced. And displacement, I was learning, has a way of making dependencies visible without a single word being raised. As I walked back up the road, I wondered how long the board could manage inconvenience before needing something more concrete than procedure to move forward. The seventh day brought structure back into the conversation, but not onto the land. It arrived as a scheduled meeting request, formal, neutral, and carefully worded. The HOA representative asked if I would be available to discuss mutual access considerations. A time was proposed. A location suggested. Everything about it implied progress without committing to direction. We met at a small office near the edge of the neighborhood, a place chosen for convenience rather than authority. She was already seated when I arrived, a notebook open, pen aligned neatly along the margin. The window behind her looked out on a parking lot where cars came and went without hesitation, their routes unquestioned. She began by summarizing the situation as the board saw it. The bridge removal had been necessary. The delay was unfortunate. The lack of a formal easement was an oversight. Not intentional, she emphasized, procedural. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I laid out my position again, not as a rebuttal, but as a clarification. The bridge existed because I had allowed it to exist. Its use had been tolerated, not transferred. The moment it was altered without consent, the assumptions supporting it collapsed. She nodded, taking notes. There was no defensiveness now, only calculation. "What would resolution look like to you?" she asked. It was the first time she'd framed the question that way. I told her I wasn't interested in retroactive arguments or rushed fixes. I wanted clear terms, defined access, written permission that reflected reality rather than habit. Until then, I had no objection to the detour continuing. She paused, pen hovering. "The detour isn't ideal," she said. "No," I agreed, "but it's accurate." The meeting ended without a decision, not a failure, a pause with edges. As I left, she thanked me for my time and said she would report back to the board. That afternoon, the bridge site remained untouched. The flags stayed where they were, no new plans posted, no equipment returned. The absence had become intentional. Neighbors adjusted further. Carpool schedules shifted. One resident began leaving his car near the entrance and biking the rest of the way. Small adaptations, each one a quiet acknowledgement that the old shortcut was no longer a given. I walked the boundary lines again that evening, not to defend them, but to remind myself where they were. The land hadn't changed. Only the expectations placed on it had. An email arrived just before dark. The HOA representative confirmed that the board would be drafting a proposal for a limited easement, subject to my review. She asked if I had any preliminary conditions they should consider. I didn't answer right away. I stood on the bank where the bridge once anchored itself and watched the water move freely beneath the open sky. Control, I realized, doesn't come from stopping things. It comes from deciding when and how they're allowed to move again. The eighth morning felt deliberate in a way the others hadn't. Nothing new appeared on the land, but nothing moved either. The road carried its reduced rhythm. The detour had settled into routine, no longer a disruption, but a cost everyone quietly paid. When inconvenience becomes predictable, it stops provoking complaints and starts shaping behavior. Late in the morning, the HOA representative sent over the draft easement. It was careful, narrow in scope, time-bound, access defined by purpose rather than habit, emergency use specified, maintenance responsibilities outlined, liability addressed in language that had clearly been revised more than once. I read it slowly, then again, not looking for flaws but for assumptions. The document acknowledged ownership explicitly. That alone marked a shift. The bridge was no longer implied. It was requested. I made notes in the margins, clarifications, adjustments, not demands, boundaries expressed as facts. When I returned the document, I included a short message. I thanked the board for recognizing the distinction between use and ownership. I noted that access could resume once terms were finalized and recorded. Until then, the status quo would remain. That afternoon, a temporary sign was added near the detour. Expect delays, access under review. It was the most accurate description yet. The HOA representative called in the evening. Her tone was different again, still calm but lighter, as if a weight had shifted from her side of the table. "The board understands your position," she said. "They're prepared to move forward on your terms." I asked what timeline she had in mind. "We'll need signatures," she said. "Recording, coordination with the contractor." I acknowledged that. I didn't offer acceleration. After the call, I walked down to the creek one more time. The space where the bridge had been felt settled now, like a pause rather than a loss. The land wasn't asserting itself. It was waiting. Over the next few days, small signs of planning returned. Surveyors marking exact lines this time, measurements taken with reference to documents I'd provided. The work resumed, but cautiously, as if the ground itself now required conversation. Residents still took the long way around. They planned for it. They spoke of it less. The absence had done its work. When access is invisible, it's taken for granted. When it's negotiated, it's respected. Standing there, watching the creek move under open air, I knew the bridge would return. But it would return differently, not as an assumption, not as a convenience, but as an agreement. And agreements, unlike habits, tend to last. The ninth part of the process wasn't loud. It was administrative. Paperwork moved. Emails shortened. Decisions that once took days now resolved in hours. The HOA representative checked in regularly, not to persuade, but to confirm. Each message carried the same undertone. Alignment had replaced assumption. Surveyors returned with a different posture this time. They measured twice. They referenced markers. They asked before stepping beyond flagged lines. The new bridge footprint stayed well within the bounds we had agreed on, narrower than before, but intentional. Purpose-built rather than inherited. Construction resumed in stages. First the supports set carefully into the bank. Then the frame assembled off-site and brought in pieces small enough to be deliberate. Nothing rushed. Nothing taken for granted. Residents continued using the detour, even as the bridge began to reappear in outline. No one tried to cross early. The absence had trained patience into the routine. One afternoon, the HOA representative stopped by again. She didn't bring documents this time. She just stood with me near the creek, watching the crew work. "They didn't realize how much depended on it," she said, not defensively, observationally. "Most things like that go unnoticed," I replied. "Until they're gone." She nodded. There was no need to say more. The lesson didn't belong to either of us anymore. It had moved outward into schedules and routes and quiet recalculations. By the end of the week, the bridge stood complete. Clean lines, new materials. It looked sturdier than before, but also smaller somehow, like something that knew exactly what it was for and nothing more. Before it opened, the easement was recorded. Signatures final, terms clear, access defined. The HOA representative sent one last message that evening. She thanked me for my cooperation and confirmed that residents would be notified of the reopening schedule. She added that the board would be reviewing other legacy access points in the area just to be thorough. I didn't reply. I walked down to the bridge instead and stood at the edge, not crossing yet. The creek flowed beneath it, contained again, but not hidden. The next morning, traffic resumed, slow at first, then settling back into its familiar rhythm. Tires on gravel, a brief hollow thump, the climb toward the main road. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. Access now carried weight. It had terms. It existed because it was allowed, not because it was assumed. As I watched the first few cars cross, I knew the final change wouldn't be visible at all. It would live in the way people paused just slightly when they passed over something they finally understood. The first full week after the bridge reopened passed without comment. That, more than anything, marked the resolution. No announcements. No ceremony. Just the steady return of movement, cars crossing at measured speeds, trucks easing their weight over the new supports, footsteps passing where water had briefly ruled again. The bridge had resumed its role, but not its invisibility. I noticed the pauses. Drivers slowed now, even those who had once crossed without a second thought. A few waved when they saw me near the creek. Not gratitude exactly, acknowledgement. The kind that comes from understanding that something works because someone allows it to. The HOA representative called once more midweek. Not about problems, about logistics. She wanted to confirm gate access times for maintenance, seasonal inspections, and emergency contingencies. Everything was scheduled now, everything documented. Dependency had found its calendar. I appreciate how smoothly this settled, she said. It could have gone differently. Yes, I replied, it could have. We both knew what that meant. There was no need to explore it further. Life adjusted around the bridge's presence with a new precision. Deliveries were rooted with certainty. Emergency services logged the access formally. The detour signs were removed, leaving faint impressions in the dirt where they had stood, a reminder that the long way around had once been necessary. I didn't post signs, I didn't restrict passage. Access wasn't denied, it was simply defined. Occasionally, someone would ask whether the bridge was public now. I would tell them no, that it was permitted use governed by agreement. Most nodded. A few asked for details. I directed them to the association. Ownership, once clarified, had redistributed responsibility without raising its voice. On quiet mornings, I still crossed the bridge first, tires on gravel. A brief hollow thump. But now the sound carried weight, not heavier, just clearer. The structure held because it had been built to, because it was respected for what it was. Standing on the bank one evening, I watched the creek move beneath it, unchanged by any of this. Water doesn't care who owns the crossing. It only responds to what's placed above it. That felt right. The neighborhood functioned, access flowed, schedules held. And beneath it all, the arrangement remained visible, not as a warning, but as a fact. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one had been embarrassed or forced. Reality had simply been allowed to assert itself at its own pace, and that, I had learned, was enough.